The morning sun barely broke through the thick fog rolling across the Naval Training Facility in San Diego when 22-year-old Marcus Thompson stepped off the bus with 30 other fresh recruits. His perfectly pressed uniform and polished boots reflected his confidence, but it was the smirk on his face that told the real story. Marcus had been the star athlete at his high school, captain of the football team, and had breezed through basic training with top marks. In his mind, this advanced tactical training program would be just another stepping stone to glory. The other recruits gathered their gear nervously, whispering among themselves about what lay ahead. Stories of brutal training regimens and impossible challenges had circulated through the barracks for weeks. But Marcus felt different. He had studied every manual, watched every training video, and even hired a personal trainer to prepare him physically. While others worried, he strutted across the compound with the swagger of someone who believed he had already won. The training facility itself was impressive but intimidating. Concrete buildings stretched across several acres, connected by obstacle courses that looked more like medieval torture devices than exercise equipment. Ropes hung from towering structures, mud pits stretched for hundreds of yards, and the sound of distant explosions echoed from the live fire ranges. Most recruits felt their stomachs drop at the sight, but Marcus only smiled wider. As the group assembled in the main courtyard, Marcus noticed the other instructors first. They were exactly what he expected: muscled, tattooed, and intimidating men in their 30s and 40s who barked orders and demanded immediate respect. These were the kind of instructors Marcus had dealt with before, and he knew how to handle them. Show them you're not afraid, demonstrate your skills early, and earn their respect through performance. But then Marcus saw him. Standing slightly apart from the other instructors was a man who looked completely out of place. He appeared to be in his late 60s, with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of too many years in the sun. His uniform hung loosely on a frame that seemed almost frail compared to the other instructors. Most surprisingly, he wore thick glasses that made him look more like a retired librarian than a military trainer. Marcus couldn't help but chuckle under his breath. This old man was supposed to train elite soldiers? The guy looked like he should be teaching a high school history class, not preparing warriors for combat. Marcus had been expecting to learn from the best, not from someone who probably hadn't seen action since Vietnam. The elderly instructor introduced himself simply as James Miller, offering no rank or impressive credentials like the others. While the other instructors spoke with booming voices about their experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, Miller simply nodded and quietly observed the recruits. His soft-spoken manner and gentle demeanor only reinforced Marcus's belief that this man was clearly the weak link in an otherwise impressive training staff. During the initial briefing, Marcus made sure to position himself where Miller could see him clearly. He wanted to establish dominance early and show this old-timer that he was dealing with someone special. When Miller asked the group basic questions about military protocol, Marcus was the first to answer, speaking loudly and confidently. When the instructor demonstrated basic equipment checks, Marcus yawned dramatically and looked around at his fellow recruits with knowing glances. The breaking point came during the first equipment inspection. Miller approached each recruit methodically, checking their gear with the same quiet intensity he had shown during introductions. When he reached Marcus, the young recruit had arranged his equipment in what he considered a superior configuration to what had been demonstrated. "I made some improvements to the standard layout," Marcus announced loudly enough for nearby recruits to hear. "I've been studying advanced tactical configurations, and I think this setup is more efficient than what you showed us." Miller examined the equipment silently for a long moment, his weathered hands moving carefully through Marcus's gear. The old man's expression remained neutral, but Marcus thought he detected a hint of surprise. Probably amazement at the recruit's innovation and knowledge. "Interesting approach," Miller said quietly, his voice so soft that Marcus had to strain to hear him. We'll see how it works for you during training." Marcus interpreted this as approval, maybe even admiration. He flashed a confident grin at the other recruits, several of whom looked impressed by his boldness. Finally, he thought, someone in charge who recognized talent when they saw it. The first day of training began with basic physical conditioning. Marcus had prepared extensively for this moment, spending months building his strength and endurance. As the recruits ran through obstacle courses and completed endless sets of push-ups and pull-ups, Marcus consistently finished near the front of the pack. Each time he completed an exercise, he made sure to catch Miller's eye, expecting to see approval or acknowledgement of his superior performance. But Miller's response was always the same: a quiet nod and a few words scribbled on his clipboard. No praise, no recognition, just the same neutral expression he wore when watching the slower recruits struggle through the same exercises. Marcus found this frustrating but assumed the old man was probably just conservative with his praise. During weapons training, Marcus's confidence reached new heights. He had spent considerable time at shooting ranges before enlisting and had always been naturally gifted with firearms. As other recruits struggled with basic marksmanship, Marcus consistently hit targets with impressive accuracy. Surely, this would get Miller's attention. After an especially impressive showing at the rifle range, Marcus approached the elderly instructor with barely concealed pride. "Pretty good shooting, right?" he said, expecting at least some acknowledgement of his obvious skill. Miller looked at the target for a moment, then back at Marcus. "Adequate for the range," he said simply. "Combat is different." The comment stung more than Marcus cared to admit. Adequate? He had just outshot nearly every other recruit in the program, and this old man called it adequate? Marcus began to wonder if Miller even understood what good marksmanship looked like. Maybe his eyesight was going along with everything else. As the days progressed, Marcus's frustration with Miller grew. No matter how well he performed, how quickly he mastered new skills, or how obviously superior his abilities were to most other recruits, the elderly instructor remained maddeningly neutral. Meanwhile, Marcus noticed that Miller seemed to spend extra time with the weaker recruits, offering quiet encouragement and patient instruction to those who struggled. This observation only reinforced Marcus's growing belief that Miller was soft, probably nearing retirement and just going through the motions until he could collect his pension. Real warriors, Marcus thought, focused on the strong and pushed them to be stronger. They didn't waste time coddling the weak. The situation came to a head during the second week of training. Marcus had just completed a challenging tactical exercise faster than any other recruit and was feeling particularly proud of his performance. As the group gathered for debriefing, Miller began discussing areas where the exercise could have been completed more effectively. "Speed isn't everything in tactical situations," Miller said in his usual quiet tone. "Sometimes moving slower and being more careful saves lives." Marcus couldn't contain himself any longer. The combination of being ignored despite his superior performance and now being lectured about caution by someone who probably hadn't seen real action in decades pushed him over the edge. "With respect, sir," Marcus said, making sure his voice carried across the group. "Some of us came here to learn from real warriors, not to play it safe with outdated tactics." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Every recruit in the area stopped what they were doing and turned to stare. Even the other instructors, who had been conducting their own training sessions nearby, paused to see what would happen next. Miller's expression didn't change. He simply looked at Marcus with those same weathered eyes, now slightly magnified behind his thick glasses. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. "I see," Miller said finally, his voice still soft, but somehow carrying more weight than before. "Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate these modern tactics for the group tomorrow? We're having a special exercise that might interest you." Marcus felt a surge of triumph. Finally, he would have the chance to show everyone what real skill looked like. He had pushed the old man into a corner, and now Miller was trying to save face by giving him a platform to demonstrate his abilities. "I'd be honored to show what I can do," Marcus replied confidently. As the group dispersed for the evening, Marcus noticed several things he hadn't picked up on before. The other instructors weren't laughing or even smiling at his confrontation with Miller. Instead, they looked at him with expressions he couldn't quite read, something between pity and concern. Even more strange, a few of the recruits who had seemed impressed by his boldness earlier now avoided eye contact altogether. That night in the barracks, the atmosphere was unusually quiet. Marcus expected his fellow recruits to be talking about the confrontation, maybe even praising him for finally standing up to the ineffective instructor. Instead, most of them seemed lost in their own thoughts, and several kept glancing at him with what looked like worry. Only one recruit, a quiet guy named David Chen, who had struggled with most of the physical challenges, approached Marcus's bunk before lights out. "Hey man," Chen said quietly, "you might want to be careful tomorrow. I heard some of the other instructors talking and they seemed really concerned about something." Marcus dismissed the warning with a wave. "They're probably just worried that their buddy is about to be shown up by a recruit. Don't worry about me. I can handle whatever that old man throws at me." Chen looked like he wanted to say more, but just shook his head and returned to his own bunk. As Marcus lay in the darkness waiting for sleep, he felt nothing but anticipation for the chance to finally prove himself. Tomorrow would be his day to shine, to show everyone that real talent and modern training could outperform whatever outdated methods Miller represented. He had no idea that tomorrow would change everything he thought he knew about himself, about combat, and about the quiet man with gray hair who had been watching him so carefully for the past 2 weeks. Marcus Thompson was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who don't need to prove how dangerous they are. Dawn arrived gray and cold, with a thick marine layer that reduced visibility to just a few hundred yards. Marcus woke before réveillé, eager to prepare for whatever challenge Miller had planned. He spent extra time checking his gear, ensuring everything was perfect for his moment to demonstrate superior tactics and skill. Today would be the day he proved that youth, strength, and modern training could outclass whatever antiquated methods the elderly instructor represented. The morning briefing took place in a different location than usual, a larger training area that Marcus had never seen before. As the recruits assembled, he noticed several things that seemed unusual. First, there were more instructors present than normal, including some he didn't recognize who wore different uniforms. Second, the equipment laid out for the exercise looked more sophisticated and realistic than anything they had used previously. Miller stood at the front of the group, looking exactly as unassuming as always. His gray hair was slightly disheveled from the morning wind, and his glasses caught the weak sunlight filtering through the fog. If anything, he looked even more like a retired school teacher than usual, which only reinforced Marcus's confidence about the coming demonstration. "Today's exercise will be different," Miller began in his characteristic soft voice. "We're going to simulate a real combat scenario. The objective is simple: navigate through a compound, neutralize specific targets, and extract safely. Mr. Thompson has volunteered to demonstrate modern tactical approaches." Marcus stepped forward, feeling the eyes of every recruit on him. This was his moment. "Ready when you are, sir." Miller nodded toward a complex structure that had been set up overnight. It was an impressive mock-up of an urban building, complete with multiple rooms, stairways, and what appeared to be civilian mannequins mixed in with hostile targets. The attention to detail was remarkable. There were even sound effects playing from hidden speakers that mimicked the chaos of a real combat environment. "You'll go first," Miller said to Marcus. "Take whatever equipment you think you need, plan your approach, and execute the mission. Time starts when you enter the structure." Marcus surveyed the scene with growing excitement. This was exactly the kind of challenge he had been training for. He selected what he considered the optimal loadout: lightweight gear that would allow him to move quickly, the most advanced weapons available, and minimal protection, since he planned to rely on speed and agility rather than defensive measures. As he approached the structure's entrance, Marcus could hear his fellow recruits whispering behind him. He was sure they were amazed by his confident preparation and eager to see him succeed where they knew they would struggle. The exercise began, and Marcus immediately implemented what he believed were cutting-edge tactical approaches. He moved fast, using his superior physical conditioning to navigate the structure quickly. When he encountered target areas, he engaged them with rapid, aggressive tactics designed to overwhelm any opposition through speed and firepower. For the first few minutes, everything seemed to go exactly as planned. Marcus cleared rooms efficiently, his marksmanship was accurate, and he felt completely in control of the situation. This was easy, exactly what he had expected from an exercise designed by someone who probably learned tactics decades ago. But then things began to go wrong in ways Marcus couldn't immediately understand. As he moved through what he thought was a cleared area, simulated explosions began going off around him. Red paint appeared on his uniform from hidden markers, indicating he had been hit by enemy fire he hadn't even seen coming. Confused, but still confident, Marcus pressed forward, assuming these were just random malfunctions in the exercise equipment. But the problems multiplied. More paint appeared on his gear. Alarms began sounding, indicating civilian casualties from his aggressive tactics, and he found himself becoming disoriented in areas of the structure he thought he had already secured. The exercise that was supposed to take 15 minutes stretched to nearly 45 as Marcus struggled with complications he hadn't anticipated. By the time he finally reached the extraction point, his uniform was covered in red paint, alarms were blaring, and he was breathing hard from both exertion and frustration. When Marcus emerged from the structure, he expected to find Miller looking embarrassed about the obvious malfunctions in his training scenario. Instead, the elderly instructor was calmly making notes on his clipboard, his expression as neutral as ever. "Interesting approach," Miller said simply. "Would you like to see a different method?" Before Marcus could respond, Miller began removing his own gear. The old man stripped down to the same basic equipment Marcus had started with, but his selections were completely different. Where Marcus had chosen speed and firepower, Miller selected heavier protective gear, different weapons and equipment Marcus had dismissed as outdated. "I'll run the same exercise," Miller announced to the group. "Same objectives, same structure." Marcus watched with a mixture of curiosity and smugness as the elderly instructor approached the entrance. Miller moved so slowly that Marcus initially thought he was being cautious because of his age. But as the exercise progressed, Marcus began to realize that what he had interpreted as hesitation was actually something entirely different. Miller moved through the structure like water flowing around obstacles. Every step was deliberate, every pause calculated. Where Marcus had charged ahead, Miller advanced methodically. Where Marcus had relied on speed, Miller used patience. Where Marcus had engaged targets aggressively, Miller seemed to neutralize them almost casually, as if he knew exactly where they would be before he encountered them. The most shocking difference was the time. Miller completed the exercise in 12 minutes, less than half the time it had taken Marcus, despite moving at what appeared to be a much slower pace. When he emerged from the structure, there wasn't a single mark of red paint on his uniform. No alarms were sounding, no indicators of civilian casualties or tactical errors. The recruits were silent as Miller calmly began putting his equipment away. Marcus felt a strange, hollow sensation in his stomach, as if he had just watched something that shouldn't have been possible. How had this old man made the same exercise look so easy? "The difference," Miller said, addressing the group but looking directly at Marcus, "isn't in the equipment or the physical conditioning. It's in understanding what you're actually facing." Miller walked over to the structure Marcus had just struggled through and began pointing out details that Marcus was horrified to realize he had completely missed. Hidden observation points that would have revealed his position to enemies. Civilian areas he had moved through without checking for non-combatants. Tactical positions that would have provided perfect fields of fire if he had taken the time to identify them. Mr. Thompson's approach would have worked well in a video game, Miller continued in his quiet voice. Fast, aggressive, decisive, but in real combat, speed without awareness usually means dead soldiers and dead civilians. Marcus felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment, but worse than that was the growing realization that everything he thought he knew about tactics might be wrong. The exercise wasn't malfunctioning when those alarms went off and paint appeared on his uniform. Those were the results of his own mistakes he hadn't even realized he was making. "Let's run it again," Miller said. "This time, Mr. Thompson, you'll follow behind me and observe. Don't engage any targets, just watch." Marcus wanted to refuse, to insist that his approach had been sound and that Miller had probably just gotten lucky. But something in the elderly instructor's tone made argument impossible. There was a quiet authority there that Marcus was only just beginning to recognize. The second run-through was even more revealing than the first. Following behind Miller, Marcus could see exactly how the older man processed information that Marcus had completely missed. Miller seemed to notice every detail of the environment, from the slight shadows that indicated hidden positions to the subtle sounds that revealed the location of targets before they became visible. More importantly, Marcus began to understand that Miller's slow movement wasn't actually slow at all. It was efficient. While Marcus had wasted time and energy charging through areas without proper assessment, Miller moved in straight lines toward objectives he had already identified. The result was movement that appeared cautious but was actually far more direct and effective. By the time they finished the second run, Marcus felt like he had been turned inside out. Everything he had believed about his own abilities and understanding of tactics had been systematically dismantled in the space of 2 hours. The worst part was that Miller had done it without raising his voice, without showing off, and without making Marcus look foolish in front of the other recruits. But the lesson wasn't over. As the group prepared to move to other training areas, Miller approached Marcus privately. For a moment, the young recruit expected a lecture or some kind of disciplinary action for his earlier disrespect. Instead, Miller simply said, "Would you like to know why your equipment configuration from the first day wouldn't have worked in that exercise?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. Miller pulled out a detailed diagram and began explaining, point by point, why the improvements Marcus had made to the standard equipment layout would have been disastrous in real combat situations. Each modification Marcus had been proud of revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how equipment actually functioned under stress. The standard configurations weren't developed by old men trying to hold back innovation, Miller explained patiently. They were developed by people who survived long enough to learn from their mistakes. Every piece of equipment, every procedure, every protocol exists because someone discovered what happens when you don't follow it. For the first time since arriving at the training facility, Marcus found himself listening instead of waiting for his turn to speak. Miller's explanations weren't lectures, but lessons, delivered with the same quiet intensity the man brought to everything else. As the conversation continued, Marcus began to realize something that made him deeply uncomfortable. Miller hadn't been ignoring his superior performance over the past 2 weeks. Miller had been watching, evaluating, and probably seeing things that Marcus had been completely blind to. The thought that followed was even worse. If Miller could see so clearly how much Marcus didn't know, what else might the elderly instructor be aware of that Marcus hadn't even considered? As they rejoined the group for the afternoon training session, Marcus found himself looking at Miller with completely different eyes. The gray hair and glasses were still there, but now Marcus wondered what they might have seen. The quiet demeanor remained, But now Marcus questioned what experiences might lie behind that calm exterior. For the first time since arriving at the facility, Marcus Thompson began to suspect that he might not know as much as he thought he did. And for the first time, he found himself genuinely curious about the man who had just taught him more in one morning than he had learned in months of preparation. The change in Marcus was gradual but unmistakable. Over the following days, his aggressive confidence transformed into something resembling genuine curiosity. He found himself watching Miller more carefully, not looking for weaknesses to exploit, but trying to understand the subtle details of how the older man approached each training exercise. Miller, for his part, seemed to notice the change without acknowledging it directly. He began spending more time working with Marcus individually, offering quiet corrections and patient explanations that the young recruit now received with growing respect rather than barely concealed contempt. 3 weeks into the program, during an evening equipment maintenance session, Marcus finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been bothering him since the tactical exercise. "Sir," he said quietly, approaching Miller's workstation, "can I ask you something?" Miller looked up from the weapon he was cleaning, his weathered hands moving with the same precise efficiency they brought to everything else. "Of course. How long have you been an instructor here?" Miller was quiet for a moment, continuing his methodical cleaning routine. "I've been teaching in various capacities for about 8 years now. Before that? Before that, I did other things." The non-answer was typical of Miller's style, but something in his tone suggested there was more to discover if Marcus asked the right questions. Unfortunately, Marcus wasn't sure what those questions were. The breakthrough came the following week during a night navigation exercise. The recruits had been divided into small teams and tasked with finding their way through several miles of rough terrain using only basic equipment. Marcus found himself paired with David Chen, the quiet recruit who had tried to warn him before his confrontation with Miller. As they made their way through the darkness, Chen finally opened up about something that had been bothering him. "My grandfather served in Vietnam," Chen said quietly as they paused to check their bearings. "He told me stories about some of the guys he served with. Real warriors who never talked about what they did, but carried themselves differently than everyone else." Marcus adjusted his compass reading. "What's that got to do with anything?" "Miller reminds me of those stories. The way my grandfather described the really dangerous ones. Quiet, careful, and absolutely deadly when they needed to be." "You think Miller saw combat?" Chen was quiet for a long moment. "I think Miller saw more combat than we can imagine, and I think that's why all the other instructors treat him the way they do." Marcus had noticed that the other instructors did seem to defer to Miller in subtle ways, but he had assumed it was just respect for an elder colleague. Now he began to wonder if there might be something more. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Instead of trying to impress Miller with his own knowledge, he simply asked for help. "Sir, I've been thinking about that tactical exercise. Could you show me what I should have been looking for?" Miller's response was immediate and patient. Over the next hour, he walked Marcus through a detailed analysis of situational awareness that was unlike anything the recruit had encountered in his previous training. Miller didn't just explain what to look for. He explained why certain details mattered and how they connected to larger tactical considerations. As the lesson progressed, Marcus found himself asking more detailed questions, and Miller's answers revealed a depth of practical knowledge that seemed to come from direct experience rather than textbook study. "Sir," Marcus said finally, "where did you learn all this?" Miller paused in his explanation and looked at Marcus for a long moment. "I learned it from people who didn't live long enough to teach it themselves." The answer sent a chill down Marcus's spine. There was something in Miller's voice, a weight that spoke of real loss and real experience in ways that no training manual could convey. That afternoon, Marcus approached Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the other instructors who had seemed particularly deferential to Miller. "Sergeant, can I ask you about Instructor Miller?" Rodriguez looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then motioned for Marcus to follow him away from the other recruits. "What do you want to know?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "His background, his experience. I'm trying to understand why he knows so much about tactics." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "You really don't know, do you?" Marcus shook his head. "Miller doesn't talk about his service record. Most of us only know pieces of it. But the pieces we know—" Rodriguez paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Let's just say that before he became an instructor, James Miller was the kind of soldier other soldiers told stories about." "What kind of stories?" "The kind that usually don't have happy endings, but somehow Miller always made it home." Rodriguez seemed reluctant to say more, but Marcus pressed him. "Can you give me any specifics? I can tell you that he was a Navy SEAL for over 20 years. I can tell you that he deployed to every major conflict we've been involved in since the 1980s. And I can tell you that there are classified operations where his name appears in reports that most people will never be allowed to read." Marcus felt his stomach drop. A Navy SEAL. For 20 years. Suddenly, every assumption he had made about the quiet, elderly instructor seemed not just wrong, but embarrassingly naive. "Sergeant, why didn't anyone tell us this?" "Because Miller doesn't want it mentioned. He says his job is to teach you how to survive, not to impress you with war stories. Most of the recruits who come through here never learn about his background unless they specifically ask the right questions." That evening, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on anything except the revelation about Miller's true background. Everything made sense now. The quiet confidence, the precise knowledge of tactics, the way the other instructors deferred to him, and, most embarrassingly, the patient way he had dealt with a cocky recruit who thought he knew better. The next morning, Marcus approached Miller before the regular training session began. "Sir, I owe you an apology." Miller looked up from his equipment check. "For what?" "For being disrespectful. For assuming I knew more than you did. For making an ass of myself in front of everyone." Miller was quiet for a moment, then returned to his equipment. "You don't owe me anything. You came here to learn and you've been learning. But I was completely wrong about you. About your experience and knowledge. You made assumptions based on limited information. That's not uncommon, and it's not necessarily wrong. It's just incomplete." Marcus struggled to find the right words. "Sergeant Rodriguez told me about your background, your service record." Miller's hands paused in their methodical work, but he didn't look up. "Sergeant Rodriguez talks too much sometimes." "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you put me in my place when I disrespected you?" Miller finally looked up, and Marcus saw something in the elderly instructor's eyes that he had missed before. Not weakness or confusion, but a depth of experience that was almost intimidating. "Because my job isn't to intimidate you with credentials," Miller said simply. "My job is to teach you how to stay alive. Your respect for my service record won't keep you breathing in combat. Understanding why certain tactics work will. But I was so wrong about everything. About you. About what I thought I knew." Miller stood up, his movement still precise despite his age. "Being wrong isn't a failure, Mr. Thompson. Staying wrong is a failure. 3 weeks ago, you thought you knew everything you needed to know. Today, you're asking questions and listening to answers. That's progress." Marcus felt a strange mix of humility and gratitude that he had never experienced before. "Will you tell me about it? About your experience?" Miller considered the question carefully. "Someday, maybe. When you're ready to hear it without romanticizing it or being traumatized by it. Combat stories aren't entertainment, and they're not lessons in glory. They're reminders of what happens when training fails and when good people make bad decisions under pressure." As the weeks progressed, Marcus's transformation continued. He threw himself into training with genuine humility, asking questions instead of showing off, and listening carefully to every piece of instruction Miller offered. His performance improved dramatically, but more importantly, his understanding of what real competence looked like began to mature. Near the end of the program, during a final exercise that incorporated everything they had learned, Marcus found himself working alongside Miller as part of a complex team scenario. For the first time, he was able to see the elderly instructor in action as a partner, rather than as someone to impress or challenge. What he observed was breathtaking. Miller moved through the exercise with an economy of motion and precision of decision-making that made everything look effortless. But Marcus now understood enough to recognize the incredible depth of knowledge and experience that made such apparent simplicity possible. After the exercise, as they cleaned equipment together, Miller finally offered some details about his background. "I was part of the last SEAL team to operate in Fallujah during the heavy fighting," he said quietly. "Most of my teammates didn't make it home. The ones who did carry memories that never really leave." Marcus listened without interrupting, understanding now that this wasn't a war story but something much more personal and painful. "I've been teaching here because the best way to honor the people who didn't come home is to make sure the next generation of soldiers is as prepared as possible. Not to impress them with what I've done, but to give them the best chance of doing what they need to do and making it home safely." Miller paused in his work. "That's why I didn't care whether you respected my credentials. I cared whether you learned what you needed to learn." On the last day of training, as the recruits prepared to leave for their next assignments, Marcus approached Miller one final time. "Sir, I want you to know that this experience changed everything for me. Not just about tactics or training, but about what it means to really know something versus thinking you know something." Miller smiled slightly, the first time Marcus had seen any strong emotion from the elderly instructor. "That's the most important lesson anyone can learn," Miller said, "in combat and in life. Real confidence comes from understanding how much you don't know and being prepared to keep learning." As Marcus boarded the bus that would take him away from the training facility, he looked back to see Miller already working with the next group of recruits. There was a young man near the front of the new group who reminded Marcus of himself just weeks earlier, confident, aggressive, and obviously convinced of his own superiority. Marcus found himself hoping that the new recruit would be smart enough to listen before he had to learn the hard way, as Marcus had, that sometimes the most dangerous and knowledgeable people are the ones who never need to prove how dangerous and knowledgeable they are.